Thank you, Dr. Hale. We're going to do a little bit of quick improvising here. We've had a couple of physicians who arrived, and I'm going to introduce Dr. Dowling. I mentioned before, a dentist from Garden City who has been a mighty fighter on our side and has taken upon himself the task of leading the fight against the forces of socialization and leftism in his part of the country, which is my part of the country, out in Long Island, in the general New York City area, metropolitan New York. And I'm going to ask him to give you a little bit of enlightenment on another phase of the fight against socialized medicine. And I'm also going to ask him to introduce our physician friends to also address you and give you some of their knowledge and give you a report on the phase of the fight from their particular point of view. So now I give you Dr. William Dowling from Garden City, Long Island, New York.
Thank you indeed. It certainly is a distinct disadvantage to have to come to the podium after Jim Hale. A man of such wit really should be on the tour. And if anybody has anything to do about it, I hope you'd get him going. It is a distinct pleasure for me to be able to introduce our two colleagues, physicians from New York, who have both at great personal expense and effort made their way here to Boston today to present us a few words from their estimable knowledge of the situation. First of all, we have Dr. Edward Daly, who is a practicing orthopedist in New York, a man who has traveled extensively throughout the country and who continues to travel extensively to present the message, a towering symbol of individual responsibility, a man who has taken his profession to his heart and who is doing all that he can to stem the tide. And Dr. Edward McNeil, again, a very dedicated man who has labored long and hard in our state to stem the tide of socialized medicine. Both of these men, Dr. McNeil from Bedford, New York, which is in Westchester County, both of these men represent, I think, the finest element within our professions. And certainly for all of the time and effort that they put in, you think that they would be somehow subsidized to be able to do more. But as it occurs, this is the way of life, and it is the only way that we can reasonably live with ourselves, is to be what we can be to whatever degree that we are capable of achieving on our own. And as such, I think they deserve a vote of thanks for coming this morning. I would like to get down to some of the reality of the topic of the day, the coming terror, as it were, in medicine. This is a matter of practical implementation of things that we have talked about in the past in very offhanded way, like it was over the horizon in the next century. But in fact, all of the mechanisms are, if not actually in functioning right now, are certainly on the drawing boards, are certainly being presented as trial legislation, as it were. And we have two examples from the state of New York of recent date, one of them having to do with the so-called recodification of the mental hygiene law. This, rather than a recodification, actually is, in a technical sense, a complete rethinking of the mental health approach. Now, we've heard many things about this particular approach in the past, and it comes to my mind that much of it has been labeled as extremist and so forth. Within the last month, an article buried on the inside pages of the Sunday News, New York Sunday News, went into great detail about how medicine can be used to enforce a degree of terror upon the people in the captive nations. This was quite specific because the gentleman in question had been a prisoner of the Soviets for something like 19 years and had survived. And he went into great detail as to the medical means that had been used to either subdue him or to create various states in which he was susceptible to various indoctrination and so forth, or in which some of his associates, friends, or otherwise were eliminated, etc. So that this is not something from a dark planet or in the next century. It is something that is being practiced today, something we might call a modified form of medical brutality. Certainly, we would not consider that such a thing would be possible among the dedicated men of the professions within this country. But this does not invalidate the concept, because many men today are being required to do many things that they would not ordinarily do of and by themselves. And I suggest that this is perhaps the core of the whole consideration of socialized medicine, that it is in fact a compulsion, a reordering of the will of what is probably one of the most independent segments of the community into such a straitjacket that thereafter anything is possible. If you can bring a man to his knees, you can make him beg for mercy. I think it has come to this that there are three distinct elements that are portrayed in varying degrees in these two pieces of legislation that I would submit. Both of them submitted as examination type legislation for various committee studies, and which, had they passed, would have gone on to be presented in the state legislature. And those three elements, I think, are the coercion by police power. Second of all, the denial of due process, and the subdivisions under this of involuntary servitude, legalized commitment, and legalized murder. Now, as the normal procedure would follow, I think these would go in pretty much that order: coercion, denial of rights, and finally the ultimate imposition of involuntary servitude and the legalization of that which has always been murder. In fact, let's say in the consideration of these pieces of legislation, these three concepts come into play several times and in varying ways. First of all, the coercion is quite implicit in the Universal Health Insurance Act as proposed, in that not only are physicians and dentists subject to the combined force of the state in terms of their requirement to perform, but also are the insurance companies and the employers who have to pay for this insurance. Likewise, you might say parenthetically, and it's Jim's term, the wumps. But in point of fact, the first instance arises from the introduction of what is a new, and let's hope everybody is on their alert for it, dangerous element being introduced into medicine, namely the medical corporation. Because in the law as proposed in New York State, this medical corporation concept, which would put a physician or dentist on a par with those who work in other corporations, achieving certain benefits tax-wise and so forth. The little stinger that's attached to this is a requirement that these corporations must treat social welfare patients or those who are covered under the Universal Health Insurance Act. This is a denial of the right of the individual as well as the corporation to a privilege of medicine which has been time-honored, the right to select a patient. This further is supported, the coercion of this particular means is further supported by several layers of quasi-governmental authority, which is then unrestrained by the state legislative process, but instead is answerable directly to the governor of the state. Likewise, I think in the concept here of the coercion, there is the consideration which we are trying to make practical use of in New York State of the employer who provides a generous piece of health insurance coverage for his employees. Under this proposed legislation, generosity, fairness is not enough. The employer must provide a stipulated amount and kind of health protection or be subject to jail and fines. This in the name of providing a new and altered health service whose aim it is to promote the right, if you will, to health care, which has now been proclaimed from the political pulpit as being a fundamental right of every citizen. Of course, at the same time, while discussing all of these rights, and as they would say in the last little paragraph of this introduction, it is the purpose of this act to encourage the development of a single system of health service benefits to which beneficiaries contribute within their means, and which will create and enhance a sense of self-reliance and underscore individual dignity. It seems like everybody else's dignity is to be underscored and assisted but mine. And this becomes rather cynical, if you will, in the overall consideration, in that I, as an employer, am then required to provide that health care insurance, which I am normally providing anyhow, but in the exact amount and specification that the state has indicated, so that my employees will then be able to achieve the type of care that they have already been achieving. So that I pay twice. I am both on the line for the production of services, should the state require it, if I am in a corporation. And second of all, I am required to pay for this service through the medical premiums that would be required, and lastly, of course, through taxation. So that when it comes to rights and individual dignity, I think that there is a case to be made that there is a major segment of the population that is being overlooked. And I should like to submit my plea for some civil rights consideration for the medical profession. It comes down to this, that the rights of one cannot be sacrificed for the rights of many. And this has been an age-old principle with us in this country, which is now being phased out in favor of mob rule. It seems totally inadequate to console me with the idea that this is inevitable, because if one has any consideration at all of the total concept of life, it is made up of far different things than monetary compensations. And I think it comes down to this, that physicians and dentists basically have not understood that the coercion by police power can be very simply withstood, as Dr. Hale has said, by simply saying no. Because in the total concept of delivery, if you will, of health services, there is no health service but that which can be delivered. Namely, if I am not willing to work for the stipulations that are given, then there will be no service. And except as there is a two-party arrangement, a two-party agreement, there is no need to even be fazed by this type of a overall state health concern. All that is needed is a little bit of unity. And I think that there are several practical ways to achieve it. I will just say in passing, before going on to the rest of the discussion. But in passing, it is to be noted that in talking to several legislators, the feeling is very well received that we are a minor segment of the population, and that as such, our rights are negotiable. Whereas for those who have a very vocal group, no matter their numbers, they will be heeded. It comes down to this, I think, that in a very essential way, we are missing the boat if we allow the medical insurance noose to be tied around our necks. Because in point of fact, if we simply refuse to accept the payment from government, and instead, no matter what the cost to us for the short term that it would involve, provide a voucher to every patient for services rendered, and even at the risk of grand personal charity, to welfare clients, to provide them with a statement of services and to bill them a nominal sum even, but to do all of our billing directly, thereby creating of the patient, in quotation marks, taxpayer, a new ally in our fight. Because a patient, knowing as he will full well know, having left our offices, that the government at present does not recompensate a patient, but will only compensate a physician. Knowing this full well, making their arrangements directly with us, they will then be forced to agree, after having knocked on welfare doors for a while, that the purpose of socialized medicine is not to improve service, but rather to create power and elite, and to make of the rest of the profession so many bulldogs, so many servants. And I think that this is really what's behind it. I think that very simply it has got to be put on this basis that the patient should be made to carry the load to the legislator rather than putting the whole load on our backs, where our numbers, being totally insignificant, will not help us. I come now to the more practical points of the coming terror, those which have to do with the denial of due process. There has been no suggestion whatsoever in all of this discussion about universal health care, about mental health laws and so forth, that there is to be any exchange of views. It is a one-way street, and we will provide or else. It comes down to this in the mental health law, where the private professional judgment of the psychiatrist now is no longer sufficient, in that he can no longer, in this proposed legislation, let's say, consider a group practice, inasmuch as this is now a prerogative of the state. Furthermore, the private judgment as to who should receive treatment and how much is no longer determined in this proposed legislation for those in various state institutions by their private physicians, but rather where private patients are to be admitted, they would have to be examined by the commissioner or his representative, let's say, without the consent of their private physicians. And these private patients would have to submit to a personal examination by the commissioner or his representative, let's say, without even his own consent. And whereas all previous regulations instructed government and voluntary facilities to service those individuals and set fees so as not to compete with private practice, such provision is lacking in the present study bill. No distinction is made either between the relationship of government to its various department facilities and between government and voluntary facilities, or between government and private facilities, lumping them all together as providers of service and making the same rules for each in relation to government. This is a departure from what has been accepted practice in the past. But most interesting, I think, is the fact that the Director of Community Mental Health Services is now given police power and instructed to actively seek out and to incarcerate the allegedly mentally disturbed. Such power at present resides with the people, the close relatives, friends, people living with the allegedly mentally ill, and the local police officer when he observes someone behaving in a manner which as an ordinary person would be regarded as disorderly. This study bill would give government a special mental health police force to actively search for and incarcerate the allegedly mentally ill. In addition, while civil liberties against private physicians railroading people by providing that certifying physicians must not be on the staff of the hospital to which the patient is to be brought, no such safeguard is provided against government physicians in government facilities, thus giving them their power to commit people to their own institutions without anybody's supervision. And so we are talking, perhaps in some rather dry terms, of some very serious implications here. Because we have now, in effect, legalized a commitment which can be allegedly for mental reasons, but which has invariably been utilized in the past for other reasons, among them being political opposition. And this is a very deadly thought. But I think, to bring the matter to a head, and without any great elaboration, I think that the ultimate terror here is the legalizing of murder through the giving of carte blanche authority in most of the current state laws that are being wiped away or being changed to murder at will the innocent and those beyond their capacity to resist. Because in point of fact, there is already a study bill, I am informed, in Albany, which proposes the legalization of euthanasia. So we have come the full circle. That which we spoke of 5 years ago as being somewhat extremist, as being rather absurd, is now right on our doorstep. And it is probably couched, and I must apologize to you, in as dry a term as I am presently speaking. Just having to review all of these little facts and what have you, it doesn't get to be very exciting reading. But at the same time, there is a fantastic wallop in what these things say. And I would suggest to you that those who are not physicians or allied with the medical profession, who are already working hard, had better get together with the physicians and the people in the medical profession generally and do everything that we can to stop this onset of terror. Or you may be the victim, or one of your loved ones. Because if they can commit you to a hospital without any of the usual legal procedures, if they can abort a child without any justification other than a whim, if they can allow a friend or a person himself to see to it that their life is terminated because of whatever reason, we're all in serious trouble. I think the time has come to reestablish and to portray triumphantly the great mystery of life. And as we humble servants of this great mystery would like to ask you to join us in providing a certain sanctity, protecting the sanctity of this life. I think that In conclusion, I'd just like to say that it is increasingly becoming clear that there is a manifest plan which seems to be emerging from the mists, and that for all of the various attempts to explain it, there is but one basic concern that goes to the heart of it all. And I think that is the basic turning from God, our Savior. And I think that without being overly dramatic about it, I think we can say that our first approach has got to be one of a return to the eternal verities, to a devotion to our God, so that we henceforth can see and reverence that life which He has given, and of which we are such humble and poor servants. I thank you.